So today's chat was going to be about communication, why it's important at Stomping Grounds, and our specific approach to communication with each other, but also with the young people themselves, and what we might say instead of some of the classic phrases you hear in other young settings, and the impact of that on their development, and why that's important to us. So we're going to just quickly go through some examples of phrases that we wouldn't say, what we might say instead, and the reasons why. It's a bit of a quick fire round. We view autism as part of a person. People are autistic, they're not diagnosed with autism, it's not something they can separate from themselves. Also, ASD stands for Autistic Spectrum Disorder, and that kind of terminology around disorder is fairly, what's the word I'm looking for? Derogatory, yeah?
So the next one would be, instead of saying they have challenging behaviour, you would then flip it and say sometimes their behaviour challenges me. And that can just help you think about why that behaviour might have come about. Then that young person isn't labelled as challenging themselves, and the adult then can support changes for that behaviour in the context that they're in.
In the kind of charitable sector, using words like hard to reach communities, flip that on its head. Consider instead of whether they're a marginalised community or they've been excluded. It's not about the community making themselves hard to reach, it's about the organisation not doing enough to meet the needs of that community. So it's always about flipping it to be about the individual or the community rather than your thoughts or views on it.
And then there's, rather than saying boys and girls, it's children and young people. I'm thinking about something that happened in a session today where one of the young people asked another, are you a girl? It's happened a couple of times because they've got short hair, and that's when we talked a little bit about pronouns, and I said what my pronouns were, and then the young person said, yeah, I'm a girl, I would say she. And then that conversation was over.
So instead of saying something like, oh, that was naughty, you would say, the situation is unsafe, can we pause? It's given everyone time to reflect and discuss. It's avoiding labelling the person and instead looking at that particular situation and that behaviour. It's not absolving anybody of responsibility. It's not saying, well, we're not going to ever talk about this thing that happened that was unsafe. But it does promote a growth mindset, which means that that young person can change certain things so that doesn't happen again, rather than, like children and young people, if they've been through a system that has always labelled them as the naughty one, then they will come to you and say, I'm naughty, and that's not great.
Comments like, that was great, well done, might become, oh, you did it. And it, like I mentioned it before, does sound a bit weird sometimes, but then it's not explicit praise, and then the things that they're doing become like intrinsic motivation rather than a judgment by us. It helps them problem solve and creates some independence without needing external validation.
So when you're sort of communicating externally as well, phrases like, oh, mum told us that Jodie doesn't like mud, instead it could be something like, Debbie, Jodie's mum, told us that Jodie doesn't like mud. Like, parents are people too, and being referred to by their name, it's just respectful, and it shows that we're listening to them as a whole and we're respecting the family as well as the young person.
This one's sort of related to the hard to reach community. So rather than a service user, we would talk about a participant or a family or community. It's about power and balance, and it means it's important to have equal, respectful and balanced relationships, and avoid putting ourselves in a sort of higher position than the people who come and access our provision.
Think of a key phrase that somebody might throw at a young person if they think they're being dangerous or doing something that they're worried about.
Be careful.
So by saying be careful, I suppose the first thing is that you're not being specific. So the young person is in the middle of doing something, they don't actually know what that means, so they don't know what necessarily they need to stop doing, but it also doesn't empower a young person to better understand how their actions might have a consequence. It's not enabling them to make their own decisions, to assess their own risks. Often find as well that when an adult says be careful, it's because they're having a panic about what might happen. not necessarily that the young person is being unsafe, but it's just how an adult perceives that behaviour.
Yeah, and also sometimes be careful actually triggers them to be more dangerous.
Yeah, especially if you've got like a PDA profile. As soon as you ask somebody to stop doing something, that it's going to instigate a response of, well, I'm going to do that more. So it can have the opposite effect for sure. So what advice would you give to a practitioner who needs to try and reframe that language and stop saying be careful as much? What could you suggest instead of that?
Think about whether or not anything needs to be said. So is it dangerous? Or a bit like what you were saying, sometimes it's about the adult thinking that, oh, it's a risk. Oh. But actually the smaller risks are important to take anyway for themselves. So does anything need to be said? Or if you think that something might happen next, narrate it. I can see that you are about to put your foot on this branch. I'm not sure whether that's solid. It might break. And narrate and support them to risk assess in their own way without telling them it's going to break.
Yeah.
Because it might not, but also working that out for yourself is part of what we do. Yeah.
And then, that thing as well around your own anxieties. I know as a new practitioner, if I watched a young person climb 3 meters up a tree, I remember that feeling of, oh my God. But it's almost been able to sort of swallow that and reassess and put it back to the young person. Do you feel safe? And if they say yes, we have to trust actually that if they feel safe, they probably are safe. I mean, there may be situations when young people haven't been able to assess that themselves because of neurodivergence or their thought processing, but most of the time a young person will know if what they're doing is safe or puts them in danger, especially if you slow it down slightly and get them to think about it while they're doing it.
Yeah, because sometimes actually adding narration to something when it is actually, you feel like it is actually unsafe and it's a risk, if you communicate too much, it's a distraction, and then that actually is the thing that makes it more risky. And sometimes it's not communicating in words, but with yourself. So if they're in the middle of doing something that you think they might fall, if you put yourself somewhere nearby, step into doing what they're doing nearby, that just they might use you as a support anyway, rather than saying anything.
Yeah. Sort of like lean out and hold your shoulder to steady themselves or something.
Yeah. And sometimes I still might get that wrong, because I could think of something last week where I was like, someone was balancing along a really, really skinny branch across the river, and I instinctively leant forward and just did that, like that. And it really made them cross. And they I didn't say anything, but they communicated with me, I don't need that. I was like, okay, yeah. So I did apologise.
Yeah. But there's another really important communication tool, isn't it? That, if as an adult in a setting you do or say something that affronts or upsets a young person, we should always acknowledge that and apologise to them. And I think that's not only modelling to them what a real apology is, it's showing to them that we are reflective and that we don't know it all, and that we're willing to listen to them, and that their opinion matters as much as ours in those situations. So I think another thing that we should say more is, oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that power and balance wise, that's always a one that, if it's a new young person, I always find that really interesting when you apologise for something, because they're like, what?
Yeah, and another thing I try to do is I'd say, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realise that that would upset you. I will try not to do that again, because again, it's showing that even if you do make a mistake in the future, your intentions are right, and that you have listened, and that we're all human, and there might be an occasion where it happens again, but it's not me trying to impose my position on them. It's a mistake, which I'm happy to own up to. And I think not only that creates that power balance of, we're all in this together, but it also models to young people how to be humble and how to communicate with other humans about your own vulnerabilities and your own sort of mistakes and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I guess there's quite a lot of young people in our setting where like that embarrassment and shame kicks in really quickly if they make a mistake. And communicating your own mistakes, at least if they can see that happens and it's not the end of the world. Nothing terrible happens to you when you say, oh, I made a mistake.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
That modelling. Yeah.
Yeah, and talking about shame has made me think as well about that kind of thing we like to do as adults, which is to further children along, push them, extend their learning, and how actually if you're carrying a lot of shame, or if you're a perfectionist, or if you have PDA, all of those things where, say I come up to you and I'm like, oh look what I did, I peeled this stick. And as a trained teacher, this is something that I instinctively always used to do when a young person showed me something, was to be like, wow, I love how you peeled that stick. What are you going to do with it next? When actually all that's doing is suggesting that the thing
Not good enough.
is not quite good enough yet, and there's more to be done.
Yeah.
And I think what we need to sit with is that the thing they present you with is the thing, and it's not for us to judge or really comment on. It is just the thing. So like stating what the thing is, and stating that they did it. Oh, you whittled a stick. There doesn't necessarily need to be anything more said than that.
Yes. Often I'll talk about the texture or the smell of something. That's just kind of my go-to anyway.
Yeah.
But it's definitely a skill that you learn to think about what you're going to say and wait a little bit, and that's okay, rather than fill in the silences, like fill in the gaps.
Yeah.
That is definitely something that is learned over time.
I suppose the ultimate aim is that we want the young person to feel pride at what they achieved, but for that to have come from them and their own sense of achievement. And we do ultimately want them to think what's next and to develop their skills and develop their understanding, but we want that to come intrinsically from them. So it might be the 5th week that they present a stick and say, look, I whittled a stick, and it might have been the same process each week, and that's fine. And then it might be, I'd quite like to put some notches here, how do I do that? And then it's coming from them, that's what they want, so you can then present them with the skills and the tools that they need to do that. But to me that's important, because it could easily be me saying to you on week 1, I whittled a stick, and you coming back and saying,
let's make it pointy.
Yeah, why don't you do this? I'll show you how to do this.
Yeah. And I think it's still that balance, isn't it? Because even then you can use some of the tools that we use, which is, I wonder if, and you can still use those in the wrong way, because you can still then, I wonder if we could, about something that someone's presented to you.
Yeah.
I think it's being switched on all the time, isn't it? It's being conscious of what you're doing until it becomes a little bit more like muscle memory.
And also knowing your young person so well, because in that situation it might be appropriate after week 2. You might know your young person well enough to say, I wonder, or what might happen if, because you know that they're ready for the next step, and you know that they feel comfortable and solid in their skills, and they're not feel anxious or nervous about that. Whereas with another young person, oh, have you thought about putting notches in it? Instantly might just
shut the stick away.
Yeah, like, well, this is obviously rubbish. You've put a judgment on it, you don't think it's good enough as it is, and that's the end of the session, because their anxiety's back up to being really heightened, feeling judged, feeling criticised. I think that's key, isn't it? Like, that often our language, even though it might be well-intentioned, you've got to think about how it's received, and whether it could be perceived as a judgment or an observation or a criticism, even if that's not your intention with that.
Yeah. But also knowing that that's actually not, it sounds really straightforward, that description of what needs to happen, but it's actually quite hard to do that, especially if you've worked with children in other settings, where it's not what happens, like if you've been in teaching, for example. You have to unlearn some stuff, don't you? And be really conscious in your communication. And I guess part of that learning about how to communicate is about observing other practitioners and seeing what has worked for someone else, or seeing something that you thought, actually I can see why. As an observer, if you watch a practitioner or a young person and you see something that's happened that's been amazing, you think, actually that worked really well. You can also work the other way and see something that hasn't worked, but understand why, And I think being able to work with the rest of your team is a really important part of that. Seeing how people say things, the pace of what they're saying, the volume of what you say, the distance, how close you are, like really conscious about mouth noises of some of the things you might say. There's lots of stuff that goes into a communication with another person, which if you know your young person really well,
you can consciously like adapt your communication to meet their needs. And that kind of the volume and where you're positioned and stuff, there's a lot to be said for that side by side working together on a project, and the communication that happens when you're not sitting face to face with a young person, because it really takes away a lot of the pressure. They don't feel questioned, they don't feel judged, it becomes much more conversational. And the therapeutic benefits of that for young people who have felt judged and pressured in the past is so important. And again, it's about that kind of, I'm not here to sit in front of you and impart all my knowledge so that you can go off and use that knowledge. It's like two people together, both inputting into a conversation and both having an equal say.
I do quite like it when you find something that they know loads about and you know nothing about. Because that really helps dynamics between you both, and I love when they share knowledge of something that you think, oh, I literally know nothing about this, please tell me all about it. And just that they sort of come alive a bit.
And that kind of flips the power even the other way, doesn't it? It puts them in control of that conversation, because you literally have nothing to give because you don't know any of it. And I'd suggest that's kind of what we're all about. Young people feeling judged or criticised or observed, and like praise and rewards and sanctions and the kind of language that might come out of that, even if you don't necessarily think it's praise or a reward, but a lot of the things that we might say could be construed as that by a young person, and could have a bit of an adverse effect on them and their engagement.
It's really hard though, because I do for it not to come out as praise. Like I did it today. Someone did, was it jumping? They jumped over something, and I was like, "Oh, nice!" I was like, "Oh,
yeah."
And you can't,
So I guess if you knew a young person, like some young people, even that nice, it's being perceived, it's being seen.
Absolutely.
And they're like, I didn't do that for you, I did it for me, and that's what we want them to do. We want to do it for them, not because you like it.
Yeah, totally.
But other young people, that's just a bit of a boost, isn't it? It's just a bit of chat.
Then sometimes you'll say things like, "Oh, you did it," and they'll look at you like, "What?
Yeah.
Why are you saying that?"
Yeah.
I'm trying really hard to communicate.
Yeah. Is that not about though what young people become used to in other systems?
Totally.
Which is like young people and children often. I remember when my kids started school and they'd come home, and if they did something well, they'd be like, "Can I have a sticker?" Like, oh my goodness, we're basically training children to want stickers every time they achieve something. And again, that's the opposite of what we're trying to do. It's like, you do it because it feels good, or it helps someone else, or it's what you want to do. You don't do it because you get something at the end of it.
I'm just thinking of, there are funny things that when you speak to someone and you, why did you say it like that? I have a lot of conversations like that. Why did you choose those words? Why did you say it like that? It sounded weird.
I think that's great though. Are you able to explain it to them, to give them the reasons?
Okay, who was it who said it to me? And I remember thinking, why did I say it like that? And I had to describe it, and then it just seemed really, I was like, okay, look, we need to change the subject now, because I really don't know why I said it like that, but thank you for drawing attention to it.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll think about it some more.
I am also human. I mean, my daughter has taught me so much about how to communicate, and even phrases like using phrases like "well done," or she's just like, "No, why did you say that? Stop saying that to me." Because even though it might be nice to say "well done" because someone did something well, it instantly means that you are the one that's issuing the praise to that young person. So you're in a position of power because you're the giver, and they've done something that you're judging to praise them on that. And I speak to a lot of people who are like, yeah, but it's different from sanctions. Like, I don't agree with sanctions, but I do agree with rewards and praise, but it's all just one line. And if you've got your sanctions here, you've got things being removed or discipline, or, not allowed to do something here because you did this, this and this, therefore I'm going to take your Xbox away. And you've got here, well done, I love this, fantastic work, or here's some sweets, or here's a sticker. The people that don't get this ultimately are here. So it isn't one. It's not like you can have praise without sanctions, because they're all on the same line.
Yeah. And also, you only have to think about your own, like, how you like to be validated. So it's not about, oh, that's nice. That's great. It's just pointless, isn't it? You want to, well, from my point of view, if someone said to me, I can see how hard you worked on that, that is much better than, oh, that looks really good.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
An acknowledgement of how much effort you've made, especially if you're the kind of person who has come from a setting where either you've been a bit invisible or you've had the opposite. I think it's that balance, isn't it? It's trying to find a way of acknowledging a skill that they've learned or effort they put in without saying it like that, like praise. And it's trying to build a toolkit in your brain, isn't it, so that you can use those. Or just then not. Just don't say anything. I guess it's that, isn't it? If you can't think of anything else that's not going to be well done, just don't say anything.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're going to have more impact just keeping quiet than just spouting words for the sake of words and filling all those gaps. And
especially the gaps. The silences are often the bits where the young person, if you leave it for long enough, they'll bring a conversation out that they want to talk about rather than one that's led by you, or they'll bring something up that they've been wondering about, and it's about being comfortable in it.
It's like that classic wait time when you're a teacher and they talk about wait time. It's the classic wait time plus and plus and plus, because it's like, actually, I don't need to say anything right now, and if you don't either, that's fine. And if you leave it long enough, undoubtedly that young person will ask the question that's been under the surface for 3 hours and they haven't felt confident enough to ask, because there's space there for them to ask it without you filling it with what your cat ate for breakfast or... I was thinking as well about you saying, validating effort, like, I can see you've worked really hard on that. And then if that's not consistent, that potentially that can have a negative impact. True. Because then the time that you have put a lot of effort into
and no one says anything,
nobody even notices it, and that's devastating. So actually, like, if you're going to give those validating statements, do them regularly, because otherwise that one time is going to hit hard. I know for me, if I do something and somebody doesn't say something, I struggle with that, because I'm so used to people commenting on things that I do. And I wonder if that's part of it as well. It's a journey for the young person as much as it is for us as practitioners, because we're trying to support them to unlearn a way of communicating that has been sort of pushed upon them, and it's difficult. It's very different to what happens in other settings.
And just the way you've been brought up yourself, like, and just going to school and the things like, it is hard. Like, definitely. And I think that's something maybe new practitioners coming in would think that, like, as though it's a skill like you either just have or you don't have, but actually you have to constantly work on it, and you will make loads of mistakes.
Absolutely.
And also that I would much rather someone pulled me up on something and said, that was did you see what happened when you said that, or could you think about saying it this way instead? I'd much rather someone said that to me so I could learn from it. It'd be uncomfortable and I'd be like, oh God, I'm terrible. But then you'd have an opportunity to know how to do it next time.
I was considering as well, like, different communication styles that we could use. I know that we work with a lot of young people who might have delayed processing skills, or their verbal communication might not be sort of the same as their peers. So sometimes verbal communication is not the answer. And even if they are able to speak and respond, we shouldn't assume that means that's their preferred method of communication just because it's ours. I don't know about you, but I find, like, if you've got if you're having a group discussion and there might be one young person who you don't think's listening and they're not engaged and they might be running around the edge or talking on top of you or whatever that is, but you continue with whatever you're doing, and then half an hour later the same young person will come up to you and ask you a really, really astute question about something that came up in that conversation, which just goes to show you that, you know, young people listen in so many different ways, and they don't necessarily need to show you that they're listening in the moment to have understood everything that was said and be interested in it. And we shouldn't be expecting, you know, like a standardized form of listening and responding to what we do.
Creating a yes space. That is one of the things that seems obvious as far as a good practitioner. And that's great. And if you can just use different language anyway, if it's something that you need to support them through by narrating or whatever, but then also acknowledge that some things are non-negotiable and they are a no. If something was unsafe, if it wasn't fitting in with the look afters, then it's okay you still have to have boundaries. There are some things that are a no. There's not very many at all if you think about it, really. There's not many things that you can't say yes to and support, but there are some things that are outright no, and that's okay. Like, practitioners can say no to the things that are unsafe.
And generally what can help with that is to be really explicit as to why. It's not just a no for the sake of a no. It's not because I told you. It's because if we do this, I'm worried that it might become unsafe. If we do this, you might chop your hand off. If we do this, you might fall in the fire. Like, saying no for the sake of saying no without really explaining why, that to me is putting your power over something. But putting a boundary in place and explaining the reasons is about keeping a young person safe. Yeah.
And I guess it's not always really, really clear cut. If you know your young person really well, there might be some things that are non-negotiable with one young person that are not non-negotiable with another. And that can be difficult in a setting where there's...
Especially if there's multiple young people together, But again, over time, as long as you're able to offer those explanations as to why, in general, young people can accept that. They can accept that actually this young person needs this to regulate, whereas you don't. And I think those are all quite important things for young people to learn about equity and you know, equal access to the same thing.
And I guess it's also about accepting that the way they then communicate to you might not be something that you want to hear. If it's something that they're really keen to do, and even if you give an explanation, a lot of the time it is accepted. Sometimes it's uncomfortable and they don't want to hear it. And you might get some precise communication in response. But yeah, I think creating a yes space is absolutely what we do, but knowing and having confidence to then actually, these things aren't negotiable, is really important.
And is that not what a quality practitioner does? Is that create a space where young people feel empowered and enabled. They don't notice the power imbalance. They don't feel that they're being judged or perceived. But as the practitioner, you hold that space for them. So you are in a position of power and control. There's no other way around it. It is what it is. But the way you present yourself can really diminish that for the young person and help them to feel safer. But ultimately, you do that in a skilled way to make sure those boundaries are tight so that everybody can get the most out of being there whilst being safe.
Yeah. If you are communicating like you want to be, it helps build trust. And then when you are putting a boundary in, they're more likely to go, okay, yeah, fine.
Yeah.
See what you mean?
Yeah, because you haven't put in stupid boundaries that are meaningless to me in the past. This one probably does mean something.
Yeah. If I hear you saying, oh God, it must be bad. You must really mean it.
That word, actually, meaningful, that's quite an important word for me, because I think, again, that it talks about, like, don't say something unless it's meaningful. Like, don't just say words, because what's the point of them? Say something that means something to that young person. Like, you know, words carry so much weight, so don't waste them. That might just be me, though.
No, because I think if you watch kids playing together, doing things together, those interactions aren't filled with like a waste of words. That it always, when they speak to each other, whether it's an imaginative play or whether they're building something in the river or whatever, they use their words with purpose. And I think adults just lose a bit of that, don't they? Like, and that uncomfortable, like, oh god, no one's talking. Like, or as a practitioner, if you're bothered about how you're being perceived to be standing there and not speaking, and like as though you're not doing your job. I know that some practitioners find that uncomfortable. Like even today, someone was like, "Oh, by the way, I am still working. I know what they're doing. They've asked me to give them space. I'm just sitting here."
Totally. We know that. We get it. Yeah.
But it's that, isn't it? It's feeling like, oh, hang on, do I need to look purposeful? I'll just narrate what you're doing. Yeah. I guess that's confidence over time and practicing.